Good afternoon. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our luncheon keynote, Ann Hollingsworth. She's a seasoned international relations specialist with expertise in government relations, policy analysis. Most recently, she served as a senior director of government relations and senior policy advisor at Refugees International, where she led the organization's advocacy efforts within the U.S. foreign policy community and provided strategic and policy guidance in all areas of the Refugee International reports. Previously, she represented International Crisis Group as a senior analyst for U.S. advocacy and research, leading the Sub-Saharan Africa portfolio for Washington, D.C. Ann has testified before Congress, been a featured panelist in a variety of foreign policy events, most notably the State Department and Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. She served in the office of the U.S. Senator Ernest Hollings, then chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. She earned a master's degree in international relations, international development from Tulane, and a BA in communications from the College of Charleston, and we are very happy to have Ann with us today. Welcome.
All right. Thank you all so much. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great. Thank you to George Mason University for having me today. I'm glad to be with you. I just want to sort of start with sort of an overview of kind of where we're at. So in 2025, we're facing the highest displacement numbers seen in our lifetime. The UN Refugee Agency, or UNHCR's 2025 Global Appeal estimated 139.3 million forcibly displaced and stateless, which included 34 million refugees. Is that a little better? Oh, great. 68.5 million internally displaced persons, and over 9.4 million pending cases for asylum seekers. The complexities of forced migration are often not fully understood by policymakers and the general public. Internal displacement within the border of the country, remains well above the total number of refugees. Access to asylum is being restricted in many parts of the world. From conflict-driven migration to natural disasters and climate-induced migration, the needs of populations are significant. There are countries with recurrent conflict, such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There are countries where the intensity of natural disasters have not only increased internal and regional migration, but also shifted the economics of a country, such as shifts of rural populations to urban settings to find work in countries like Somalia. Conversations continue on how to mitigate conflict and curb migration. Statistics can become overwhelming, and the imperative of first-person storytelling should be centralized on locals in any communication strategy. Given the current catastrophic funding cuts in humanitarian and development assistance, and the resulting shrinking of programming and aid delivery, as well as the role of humanitarian diplomacy, it is important to think through new, innovative approaches while supporting more efficient humanitarian and development support. Donors have understandably asked, and have been asking for some time, about better ways to prevent conflict and support humanitarian needs with more limited resources and different approaches. But, and this is the key point I want you to remember today, it is important to note that the migration and humanitarian sector is not starting from scratch on such ideas and research. Successful policy prescriptions and agreed upon best practices, which I will highlight later, in humanitarian and conflict settings, notably around localization, cash assistance, access to the labor market, and resilience initiatives, needs to be supported and implemented. And at this uncertain and frankly very unsettling time in the international migration sector, we must honor the operational aid workers and the displaced people they support by providing the necessary funding, the diplomatic backing, and multilateral and bilateral support that is critical to help mitigate conflict and save lives. So I first wanted to start with the importance of field research in humanitarian displacement, in my experience. First is bearing witness. What that means is with a new emergency, shining the light, raising alarm bells, witnessing human rights violations, speaking to all actors that are part of the displacement crisis, and most importantly, talking to the people themselves, respecting, understanding their perspectives, and where constraints and opportunities exist, avoiding assumptions, a really critical part. And finally, I just want to reiterate to you that refugees and displaced people are caught up in brutal wars and conflict. These are very human stories. So very briefly, I just want to cover the definition of a refugee according to UNHCR. A refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Yes. And according to UNHCR, an internally displaced person, IDP, is a person who has been forced to flee his or her home for the same reason as a refugee, but remains in his or her own country and has not crossed an international border. Unlike refugees, IDPs are not protected by international law or eligible to receive many types of aid. A reminder, this is far and away the highest number of displaced people, despite what many assume is the total number of refugees. It's actually IDPs. So the current context for displaced issues. I just want to highlight a few issues just to sort of set the scene here. So first of all, camp versus urban displacement. The traditional model of refugee camps has shifted, but sometimes the narrative doesn't reflect that. Many refugees and IDPs are in urban settings to find work or to be with relatives there. Assistance strategies have shifted to reflect this change, including IDP and out-of-camp policies at UNHCR, but many often struggle to receive assistance. As an example, from interviews with Syrian refugees in Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, many shared concerns about high housing costs and limited work options. Next, funding for localization is beginning, but not fast enough. This has been kind of a hot topic in our field for the last few years, and donors and INGOs have previously agreed to significantly increase the percentage of funding to local organizations. The previous USAID administration pledged this as well, but local organizations need much more support. These organizations will be there long after the United Nations and other international non-governmental organizations are gone. An increase in the intensity of natural disasters due to climate change and the resulting impacts, including drought and flooding, is a worrying humanitarian and displacement trend. Cyclical droughts in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, as an example, are now shifting to consistent concerns about pre-famine and famine. In other words, there's little time to recover from one to the next. Insecurity. Insecurity from the Democratic Republic of the Congo to gangs and lawlessness in Haiti comes in many forms. New conflicts can displace hundreds of thousands of people in a very small period of time. As we enter year 3 of the war in Sudan, between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, the UN says that this has already claimed tens of thousands of lives and displaced over 12.4 million people, including more than 3.3 million refugees in neighboring countries. Which leads us to regional displacement. Regional displacement is happening in countries like Chad that are still hosting refugees from the previous conflict in Darfur in the early 2000s. Resources remain limited in eastern Chad despite additional funding and staffing. But regional displacement examples impact all neighbors, thinking of the Syrian refugee example. According to UNHCR, Syrian refugees have sought asylum in more than 130 countries, but the vast majority, about 5 million, live in neighboring countries within the region, so Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. Turkey has the largest population at 2.8 million. Obviously, some Syrians are now returning to Syria since Assad's departure. Russia and China's influence in parts of sub-Saharan Africa have been increasing for years, with varied types of business arrangements, government deals, and infrastructure projects. As the US steps back in development aid, we must think about who is going to fill that gap. And finally, just want to reiterate, and I'll be doing that multiple times today, the imperative of the independence of humanitarian delivery. So let's talk about a few current challenges. First of all, funding and donor fatigue. This has been building for quite some time. Global displacement has more than doubled over the past decade, which is just really something that we should all be thinking about. And donors have not been able to keep up with the needs. Many donors have lamented about the same kind of aid packages being delivered with context only getting worse. And while there is room to discuss efficiency in humanitarian and development aid, some rhetoric about wasteful spending does not reflect field operational constraints or the expensive logistics in an insecure environment. In other words, sometimes you have to use a helicopter because the roads have been washed out and you can't use a car to reach a food distribution site. Political will. I'll bring this up a couple of times as well, but some government and donors are not fulfilling their commitments to solutions, either by not prioritizing or not funding. Drought and climate factors. So not only is climate change contributing to more displacement, its impacts are causing a loss of livelihoods. IDPs and refugees may be put in locations less susceptible to those impacts, like being moved away from oceanfront areas, but that can result in a loss of livelihoods for their families if they are fishermen, for example. And whole sectors are being limited due to climate change impact, such as herders in Somalia. Protracted displacement. So more crises are becoming protracted, which means the displaced caused by the crisis are as well. Even with initial welcome, host communities and host governments may falter in their support as years go on. Underreported and neglected. I use Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan, but there's many others, and it's often frustrating to see dire humanitarian and displacement challenges not getting reported in the media. As displacement has expanded, even those on the front page of the New York Times can struggle for resources and commitments. And finally, global refugee resettlement. More refugee resettlement is needed from the average of 25 countries that participate in UNHCR's resettlement program, as the current U.S. administration steps back from that. The referral and vetting process for refugees is stringent, and the opportunity to build a new life must be protected. Okay, humanitarian funding. I know this is a little hard to see. Humanitarian needs are expanding, displacement is increasing. We've covered that. The current U.S. administration's decision to effectively close the U.S. Agency for International Development and stop the majority of overseas humanitarian and development assistance must be reversed. Global humanitarian leadership is needed, and some other donors, including some in Europe, are unfortunately also stepping back from additional funding commitments. So just as an example, see here these regional funding and country funding appeals as of the end of March, just to show where things stand. Many of these appeals, as you'll see at the far end column, are 0% funded. 0% funded. And it is not just the top line funding concern, but the categories. Often new emergencies receive funding and attention, but in the current climate, even those struggle to get life-saving aid funded. For longer-term funding, things are even more fragile. What I saw in my research was longer-term funding projects getting cut as new emergencies arose, and at times that was an understandable shift given the scale of new need. But this cut in funding to longer-term development often undermined the goals of helping a person become self-sufficient. From Chad to Ethiopia to Haiti, this was a recurrent theme, and resiliency-style projects were often on the cutting block, which hampered progress. So, barriers to progress. So what is hindering better implementation of great ideas? In my over 15 years of research and advocacy work, I have traveled globally with colleagues to assess humanitarian displacement crises and escalating conflicts, interviewing refugees and IDPs themselves to learn about their concerns and needs were understandably the most important experience. And their compelling stories and recommendations to better their own lives have been invaluable. So was talking to government leaders, United Nations, private sector, international operational organizations, local organizations, and experts to understand what hinders conflict mitigation and efficient aid delivery. Yes, funding was and is a consistent concern. but so is the lack of political will to support those ideas. Not investing in international diplomatic resources and relationship building, which can lead to mixed messages, uneven strategic coordination with partners, escalating humanitarian access restrictions, not investing enough in communicating opportunities for success in a conflict zone or the replication of proven pilot projects, investing in conflict prevention to ease community tensions, and supporting the independence of humanitarian operations. So let's dig a little deeper. In terms of the lack of political will to support good ideas, some examples I have seen have included host countries restricting labor market access for refugees or making bureaucratic hurdles so extreme it keeps refugees in the informal labor market, a host country's lack of approval for durable shelter options, the thinking so as to not acknowledge the possibility of longer-term displacement, major donor countries not reinforcing their own obligations, including protecting the commitment to the neutrality of humanitarian aid delivery, major donor countries not providing operational organizations enough flexible and multi-year funding, and missed opportunities to expand funding for local organizations, including by not covering overhead costs and financial training for newer organizations. In terms of not investing in international diplomatic resources and relationship building, I just want to reiterate that these diplomatic relationships really matter in a crisis. When a conflict erupts, or there is a kidnapping of a humanitarian worker, or a regional displacement crisis arrives on top of another, it does matter that relationships of trust have been built. It is invaluable for delegations to travel to countries of concern, noting through my experiences the value of joint U.S. agency staff delegations working together on an assessment, or members of Congress and their staff going to a refugee camp in Bangladesh, which helped get attention and messaging in country at an important time for the Rohingya refugees there. These relationships may also help diffuse tensions in a country whose situation is growing dire. Regarding uneven strategic coordination with partners, I raise this just to highlight the challenges that come with too many cooks in the kitchen, even with best laid plans. That at times can mean a special envoy speaking counter to the ambassador, or generally mixed messages being communicated on what a country's diplomatic priorities are. It can also mean a lack of coordination with international and local non-governmental organizations. When and how you raise the alarm on a displacement crisis to decision makers really does matter. Regarding escalating humanitarian access restrictions, these have been reported in Gaza, in Ethiopia, in the Tigray context, and Sudan, just to name a few. Humanitarian aid must flow unimpeded. And as far as not communicating opportunities for success, this is a really critical one, guys. In a conflict zone or the replication of proven pilot projects, this has been a consistent struggle. Great strides have been made at INGOs and UN agencies, but much more work is needed to be done to be able to talk about what is working well in the field and messaging this to donors. As an example, places where there is a solid local organization footprint, like in Ukraine, would have made that a great case study on significant localization funding investments. And some certainly were shifted to Ukraine, but much more should have been done. Women's economic empowerment projects, including microloans, have succeeded and should be expanded. Livelihoods projects that keep displaced populations working in their field of choice should also be expanded. And finally, here's a point to also take away with you. Prevention is cheaper. This seems to be a message that continues to not hit, and we need to help it hit. Projects such as conflict prevention to ease community tensions, investing in host communities alongside refugees, and disaster risk reduction initiatives in countries where natural disasters strike, like the Philippines as an example, are examples that we all should be talking about and replicating. Okay, now we're to the good part. So let's talk about some agreed upon best practices in this field. I get very excited about this section. There's a lot of good stories to tell. So first of all, data-driven development assessments on how to achieve longer-term self-sufficiency have been conducted. When I was doing research in Ethiopia, Myself and my colleague were in the Somali region of Ethiopia, and we were focused on drought and particularly women and children impacted. So when we were doing this research in Ethiopia, we of course were talking to the refugees themselves, we were talking to host communities, and we were talking to development professionals. Because this population actually was a very good example of a population that could possibly be integrated in with the local community. So we asked development professionals about self-sufficiency and those opportunities for integration into the local communities. And this wasn't the first time that we heard the following: no more data is needed. We know what the best course is from years of research and just can't get the support to implement such a policy. I don't want to diminish how complex some of these ideas are. Local leaders and host communities and refugees to be on the same page to integrate into a community can be challenging. But particularly for development professionals that have worked for many years in the same country and have built relationships with the displaced populations and incorporated those perspectives, those ideas should be heard. Next, case studies around refugee inclusion in the labor markets of host countries are showcasing economic benefits of opening the labor market to refugees and utilizing their expertise. From interviews I conducted in Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon during the height of the Syrian refugee context, one of the key themes with the refugees was livelihoods access. The Syrian population came well educated. Depending on each country, here were some examples of what we heard. The Syrian population came highly educated, but there were doctors driving cabs because they couldn't be certified to practice medicine. Work permits restrictions were too expensive and bureaucratically challenging to obtain. Informal labor markets were all that were really allowed, which left little protection for wage disputes or harassment charges. And women were provided livelihood opportunities only in certain areas, such as cooking and crafts. Now, strides have been made in general on the topic of refugee inclusion in labor markets through excellent work by the International Labor Organization, the Tent Foundation, and development and international financial institutions. But much more work is needed with both the private sector and development agencies. So next, assessments on the fiscal value of conflict prevention programming activities to mitigate and prevent escalation, such as in advance of a potentially contentious election, are documented. Over the past 20 years, there's been much reporting and examples of conflict prevention and community outreach investments that minimize tensions or expected violence. There are also examples of what happens when investments are not made, such as around the 2008 Kenya post-election violence. So, additional best practices. Refugee integration with local populations should expand by working with local government actors and providing support for host communities who themselves are often in need of assistance. This is a really important shift in the humanitarian development sector that really started with the example of the Syrian crisis. Assistance strategies in the early years of the crisis incorporated assistance for host communities. AID has looked at this issue more carefully, particularly where integration is possible. Next, technology advancements to better predict natural disasters and climate impacts is critical in responsibly planning for migration and humanitarian needs. As the intensity of climate change increases, aid agencies need to continue technology support to program effectively. The usual areas for natural disasters are expanding, and technology can help. And finally, development assistance, such as livelihoods programming, need to be implemented alongside of humanitarian assistance at the very start of a new emergency. When I visited Chad in 2015, USAID was cutting 50% of food aid to the population. So these were refugees that came from Darfur, who had been there for about 14 years. We visited camps and local markets. And my biggest takeaway from that experience was that development aid, notably livelihood assistance, should begin at the start of a new emergency, alongside that life-saving assistance. For some of those Sudanese refugees who had been there for over a decade, that shift may not have prevented their need for continued food aid, but could have helped in a shift towards self-sufficiency. Cash assistance to support local markets and economies is also now an agreed upon tool, and I wish that had been used more at the start of that crisis. So life-saving assistance. I'm talking a lot about development and resiliencies. I really don't want to lose the thread here on the imperative of life-saving assistance given the recent humanitarian assistance cuts. We must not be distracted from the imperative of life-saving assistance, including food, health, water, and shelter, which is foundational aid that must be protected and expanded. I mention this even as new humanitarian displacement emergencies today are not getting the support that is so desperately needed. So there's a lot of examples when I talk about agreed upon best practices, but the grand bargain actually is one of the best ones. So in 2016, the Grand Bargain, which is a report that is online, which brought together humanitarian donors and operational organizations in agreement regarding goals and best practices on issues such as localization, cash assistance, and resilience initiatives. So this was a really important document at the time that basically said, we know we can do better, and this is the way forward. And I think some of that made progress, but there's a lot more to do, and a lot more political will is needed for them to get some of those pledges to the finish line. So I've talked about private sector a little bit, but I want to just reiterate and give some credit where credit is due. I think private sector and philanthropic organizations in this field have been funding a lot of really important projects that, quite frankly, are not getting a lot of oxygen, and they should be. When you're talking about funding projects around technology, around climate impacts, women's economic contributions, emergency relief, data-focused migration trends, and labor mobility and inclusion, among many other migration topics, I think this is a really important way to talk about there's a wider scope than we think of companies and interests that are working on the issues around migration. Their support and working in partnership with experts in the migration field alongside the impacted populations themselves to smartly drive the programming needs will result in better and more efficient results. So in closing, I really want to reiterate that there's a lot of best practices and good ideas that need to be supported, that are out there. They need oxygen, they need visibility, they need the media to report on them, and they need the funding and political will to back them up to fulfill their goals. I want to thank everyone for your time today on this important topic, and I look forward to staying engaged with many of you. Thank you. Sure.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a really great talk. I have two questions. One is on the need for livelihood programs to happen right at the moment of displacement, which I think is really a great point. I'm curious though, because so often I think the hope is that this is going to be short term. Yeah. So, but obviously often it isn't, and it's easy to retroactively say, oh wow, I wish that 10 years ago we had set this stuff in motion. So I think, could you talk a little bit about how do you kind of predict which thing is short term or which one should have kind of livelihood programming? Mm. And then the last point you just made about the need for media, talking about the programs, not just the crisis. I would love to hear more about your thoughts on the impact of the media.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, so the first question, particularly on that livelihoods piece, which, you know, I use the example of Chad, but I could use that example in a majority of the field research that I've done. And the reason for that is there's an assumption that people are coming to places and fleeing violence unskilled. And sometimes that is the case. But most of the time it's not. You know, they have an expertise on agriculture, on farming, on herding, on you know, cooking, on medicine, all of those things. And so I think, you know, when I tie in livelihoods to places and look, I have to say that this gets into where political will falls, which is many countries don't want to admit that this population is going to have to stay there longer than a few months. And that's where we get into where decisions are made on what is actually allowed as far as work. You know, governments that have populations that are unable to make a sufficient living are going to be competing with refugees in that space. But for us, you know, looking at this enough as we have, it is tapping into, I think, a valuable economic contributor to the local economy. It is shifting away from the necessity of reliance on humanitarian and development aid. And it also can tie into certain sectors that the country actually needs. There's a lot of messaging around this that can make it resonate more. So if there are places where, you know, more fishing and fishermen are needed, you know, who have that skill set, let's put them there. But it also ties into examples, and Philippines would be an example that I would think through of when internal displacement happens and they're moved away from where their livelihoods are, what do? And if there are not livelihood programs to train them for new opportunities, if there's not an understanding of how they're going to be able to support their families in this new area that they've been put, then they are going to be reliant on aid. So there's a lot of messaging, I think, around that I think could be very advantageous for governments that are hosting refugees, and also, of course, for the refugees themselves. Yeah. And then the second question, remind me. Just the media. So since I started this field, this was 2007, we talked a lot about what it means to get, you know, an op-ed in the New York Times or front page of the Wall Street Journal, to get attention from senior level policymakers. The media narrative has really shifted during this time and space. It's not just social media anymore, which, by the way, a recognition that most refugees have their own phones and are following social media and media themselves. But it is how media is focusing on the international conflict and international humanitarian space. And what has happened, unfortunately, is many of the larger newspapers and media organizations have cut back dramatically on the international reporting. They have listed the cause being expense, which it is expensive to go to some of these places. And quite frankly, some citing the lack of interest in foreign affairs with their readers. And I just don't believe that that's true. And so I think what we really need to do is having more conversations around what is working right, which is why I keep emphasizing this in everything that I put out there, as opposed to everything that misinformation may be sort of feeding into. Let's talk about those best practices and what's working. And let's also have really good reporting when a new emergency arises and we need to be able to get senior leadership to pay attention, because that really still does matter. Yep.
Thank you for your presentation. And I'm as a person who's been in the field for 18 years, as you have, I'd be interested to hear your opinion on why you think the current administration has cut funding so drastically, and if you see any potential opportunities that will emerge from it.
Yeah. I will not pretend to know the motivations there, aside from foreign assistance being a target, which it has been a target. I think that, well, here's what's interesting, because we've talked about this a bit, because I worked a lot on appropriations over these many years. And a traditional model of humanitarian assistance being separated out from overall foreign assistance was a traditional model that worked to get bipartisan support. And there was bipartisan support for pockets of humanitarian assistance that were consistent and proud. And that included conservative Republicans that supported food assistance, which also supported U.S. farmers and the shipping industry. But also because they themselves traveled to the field to look at these situations. And they had a personal buy-in to that. And I think what has happened, because it's not just, the Hill, I think, has stepped back from, full-throated commitment on foreign assistance as well. And something that we've talked about in our community is during COVID, when there was no travel, there were no staff dells, there were no co-dells that were happening to look at security situations or humanitarian situations. That really, I think, hurt the overall foreign aid narrative, because people like to be able to say, I just came back from Jordan and met with these refugees, and I met with these political officials, and this is what they're telling us that they need. So I think it's been unfortunate that the humanitarian and development piece has been rolled up into, I think, an overall narrative of an anti-foreign assistance support, which, quite frankly, I think there's a lot of polling out there that would dispute that. I think a lot of Americans are very proud of the life-saving assistance that we've provided. So there's been, I think, a battle of misinformation about what our humanitarian development assistance does. But I also think that the last 5 years, particularly on the Hill, this bucket of definition of foreign assistance has made, I think, the humanitarian development pocket vulnerable. Absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times, like when you're briefing congressional staff, they are pushing back and they're saying, we need to see some wins here. We need to know that this investment is working. And so these case studies were really critical in our messaging, through congressional testimonies, through pitching questions, to be able to highlight what actually is working, to, I think, counter a negative narrative. And I think that, unfortunately, we are at this place. I hope that these decisions are reversed, because as the United Nations, the World Food Program, and global health agencies have talked about over the past 4 weeks, millions and millions of lives are at stake with these cuts. And many countries are going to, I worry, follow the U.S. example to step back.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Let's take about 5, and then the afternoon session will begin in the auditorium.